Welcome participants to this course on conditioning program designing offered by NPTEL, and you are in week 2. In week 1 you were introduced to the concept of conditioning and the science behind conditioning. Week 2 is mainly focused on conditioning methodology and principles of periodization and its application in conditioning program designing. So, in the lecture 1 of week 2, Professor Kaustubh would have introduced you to the program methodology. So, in the next 3 lectures, that is lecture 2, 3 and 4 of this week 2, I shall be introducing you to the concepts of principles of periodization in programming the conditioning program. So, I am Wing Commander Chandrasekhar Guru. I am a sports physician with the Department of Sports Medicine, Armed Forces Medical College, Pune. So, the learning objectives of today's lecture would be to learn about the historical use of periodization in sports, know various definitions and misapplications of periodization, discuss the components and the types of periodization plans that are commonly used, and try to apply the concepts in developing various biomotor qualities. To start with, why do we need periodization? To achieve any kind of maximizing the performance or to achieve that optimal level of performance, you need to progress in the following steps. To have an initial training to build the foundational abilities, thereafter to go into the phase of specific training for the desired morphological and functional adaptation in the human body to take place, and try to sustain this developed ability with respect to the physiological as well as the psychological aspect, and be prepared to peak at the right time to compete in the competition. So, this can be achieved only by the process of conditioning that you would have already been introduced to, but how do we employ this is by using the principles of periodization. So, periodization is the essential tool if you want to have a long term athletic development to reach the goal. So, the word periodization originates from the word period which means division of time. So, the definition goes this way: it is a method of dividing the training process into smaller, easy to manage segments which are referred to as phases of training. The purpose of periodization is necessary as an intrinsic component for foundation that is required. It is basically to maximize the physiological adaptation and also to improve the performance at the right time. So, the basis is foundation for compiling the athlete's training plan. That is why periodization is important for designing a conditioning program. So, let us dwell upon certain aspects with respect to the history of development of periodization concept per se. So, during the time of ancient Olympics itself, this term has found its way. Philostratus referenced the annual plans of Greek Olympians in his various materials. The concept of preparatory phase and then few competitions followed by rest has been witnessed in various writings related to ancient Olympic games. Galen and structured intensity. So, it was the Roman physician Claudius Galenius suggested that relaxing a period is required after training. He is the one who introduced the terminology of 10 months of training period for the Olympics, 1 month of specific training for competitions, and 1 month of recovery or rest after the program or the competition. So, now the so called transition phase. Moving on to the modern Olympics from 1896 onwards, the periodization concepts have been used by the American and the European athletes. in fact, the Finnish runners have emphasized on the Gallen's model of periodized training. German athletes have used that concept in their 1936 Olympics, and they are the first one to use the 4-year long-term plan for the Olympics as a periodized structured training. Post World War II, it was Leonid Matveyev of the 1960s, belonging to the Eastern Bloc of the Europe, is a Russian scientist who is considered as the father of modern periodization. He had introduced the model of annual plan, dividing it into different phases, sub-phases and training cycles. He was the one who introduced the classic model. Some even referred to it as the Matveyev's work. One important personality in the field of periodization is Tudor Bompa. Even now you will find textbook in his name. Is the one who applied the periodized annual plan into training programs. He created the concepts of periodization of biomotor abilities and led an unknown athlete to become a champion in 5 years, demonstrating the power of methodology. So, how do you define periodization? Periodization, as per Bompa, is a systematic planning of training for peak performance. That is one school of thought with respect to the peak performance. However, later on in 2016, Gregory Half had defined periodization with the concept of adaptation, where he says it is a logical, sequential, integrative approach to manage fatigue and maximize adaptation. So, here the concept has now been kind of integrated with the physiological adaptation. So, Half has emphasized the integration across the physiological, biomechanical and psychological variables. Example, managing the training loads in football to prevent overtraining. So, that is how periodization has two different school of thoughts, one in the form of peak performance, the other one in the form of achieving the adaptations required to reach the desired goal. So, with the two important aspects, you basically have two different way of approaching with the concept of periodization. One is purely based on the time, so that is what the exact word meaning of the word itself is about. So, periodization of the annual plan, that is managing the time. So, how you are able to create a plan and then divide them into phases and sub phases to manage the time. The other concept is about the using the periodization principle itself to develop the biomotor abilities which is required for that particular sports, that is managing and structuring training to develop these qualities to achieve the desired goal. So, this kind of dual approach is crucial for maximizing your physiological adaptations and performance. So, the periodization represents the holistic framework which denotes the why and when of the training program. Planning becomes the second important component within the periodization, which defines what of the training program. So, it basically organizes the training structure into different phases to achieve a targeted goal, that is the biomotor quality. So, here you are kind of synchronizing the time as well as the biomotor quality into structured phases. So, that is what you call as planning. Programming is further a subset of planning, which means you are programming using different training modes and methods within the particular structure of planning to achieve that particular biomotor quality by means of using different sets and repetitions. So, this defines the how of that particular training program. So, there is clear cut distinction between what you call as periodization, what you call as planning and what you call as programming. In simple term, periodization will cover the entire gamut of the training cycle. Sub phases or the phases of this entire program is called what you call as planning, and that defines the target or goal for that particular small phase. Within the phase, how you are able to achieve that goal is defined by the programming or the training variables involving the sets and the repetition. So, the objective of periodization is to maximize the physiological adaptation, prevent overtraining, optimize the performance and facilitate recovery. So, it is the balanced way by which you recover and manage the load so that it ensures a long term performance sustainability. So, when you see the hierarchy cycle of the periodization component, periodization cycle can be as long as 4 years, say for example in elite athletes who are competing for the Olympic level games. So, it can be a multi-year plan from 2 to 4 years, and they have long term goals. So, the goals can change as per the progression of the athlete's goal over a period of time. So, they are generally quadrennial goals. That is a quadrennial cycle. Macro cycle is generally an annual training plan, where within the 4-year quadrennial cycle you can have 4 different macro cycle annual training plan. It generally refers to 1-year competitions. Mesocycle is further dividing that 1-year plan into training phases in terms of number of weeks. See, generally it varies from 2 to 6 weeks depending on the goal that is fixed by the coach and the athlete. Microcycle is further the lowest kind of hierarchical in the hierarchical cycle is the microcycle, which describes over 1 week what is the variation or the method of the training that is going to be undertaken. So, that gives you the nuts and bolts of the training method and the modality. So, it deals with the repetition, it deals with the sets, number of sets, it varies the different principles of training so that you are able to achieve the final mesocycle goal and thereafter over on to a macrocycle goal, and that will lead you on to the quadrennial cycle goal. So, that is the concept of hierarchical cycle in periodization. Further, if you see the components of an annual macro cycle, this annual macro cycle is further divided into mesocycles as I said before. So, in terms of periodization phases, this can be divided into based on the development of the biomotor quality. So, it can be divided into a preparatory phase, a competitive phase and a transition phase. A preparatory phase would mean where you are preparing the athlete to move on to the more of a sport specific skill and tactical learning in the subsequent competitive phase. So, preparatory phase is the word as it means preparing the athlete. Competitive phase would mean the phase in which the athlete is more focused towards the competitive performance. So, it is very specific to the competition and the sport that he is practicing. Transition phase is post competition, you need a period of relaxation or active rest. So, that is the transition phase. Further, this preparatory phase is subdivided into 2 important sub phases. Initial one where the athlete starts the training program is the general preparatory phase. General preparatory phase is the phase where your conditioning activity happen, where your foundational motor abilities are basically worked upon to prepare the athlete to go on to the next level, that is the specific preparatory phase, where more of higher volume and higher intensity in terms of the programming is happening, as well as the training methods is more focused towards the biomotor quality, which will help in performing the sports related task in the competitive phase. So, that is why it is specific preparatory phase, which is more related to the sports the individual is practicing. Then comes the competitive phase. Further, the competitive phase is divided into a pre-competition phase and a competition phase. A pre-competition phase is the phase which differentiates from a preparatory phase, wherein the individual goes on to more kind of specific related training, which is more in terms of the programming of microcycles is made in terms of reaching to specific adaptations in the individual. So, it will be more of sports related technical learning, more of a motor quality which is more related to the competitive performance. So, that would be in the pre-competitive phase. Competitive phase is the phase where the athlete is actually engaging in the competition. So, you may have tapering of the training so that individual can kind of super compensate and then perform better during the competition. So, if you see the overall framework of periodization, periodization components will be somewhat like this, something similar to a school timetable which you can normally seen in the schools for the children. So, you have an entire annual plan, and then the annual plan is divided into phases like preparatory phase, competitive phase and transition phase. Thereafter, you have the sub phases within the main phases, with the general preparatory phase, specific preparatory phase, pre-competitive phase, competitive phase and the transition phase. So, you are very clear that what you are going to achieve in these particular phases. So, dividing the entire period into different phases gives you the opportunity to have a defined timeline. So, the entire period of 1 year has been divided into sub phases. This is all about the periodization components. This becomes the overall framework for designing any conditioning program, right. So, let us focus more a bit in terms of annual plan structures and the periodization models that are available. So, as we said, it can be a monocycle focusing from one major competition to another major competition, and you need to peak only for that particular competition. So, that is monocycle. It can be a bicycle periodization model wherein you have two distinct competitive phases, and the peaks are also accordingly planned, so that you have to peak for different competitions during the annual training cycle. Example commonly seen in track and field athletes with which actually depends on the indoor or the outdoor seasons. There is something called as a tricycler plans, wherein you have three major competitive phases with three different peaks. Say in sports like martial arts, artistic sports, you may have 2 to 3 championships over a year. So, the athlete is expected to peak at all these three different main competitive phases. There may be even multiple peak. So, there may be teams participating in the competitions throughout the year. So, you may have to have multiple peaks over the period of 1 year itself. Say in commercial sports like cricket or baseball, in professional tennis, you would find athletes participating in different competitions over the entire time of the year. So, here you would need more of a multiple peak periodization models. It is basically the sporting need and the featuring of the competitions during the annual plan decides what kind of periodization model that you would like to undertake. So, coming on to the types of periodization is basically dependent on the biomotor quality that you want to train that individual. So, it depends on the needs and the variable with respect to the planning and programming. So, a linear periodization would be the training program is gradually increasing linearly with respect to the varying the training programming variables. Non-linear will be a program which kinds of undulating. It can have a peak and then a trough and then a peak and then a trough. Block periodization is something like you wanted to develop a specific biomotor quality during a particular block, then you want to transmutate that kind of developed adaptation onto the next block. So, you can plan something like a muscle endurance followed by strength and then thereafter going on to the power development. So, that is something an example of a block periodization. Something also called as reverse periodization, where you kind of train the biomotor quality which you want to be adapted last as a first, and then thereafter you go on to the next biomotor quality. There is something called as concurrent also, where at the same time you kind of try to address multiple biomotor quality in the same periodization model itself. We will be again describing it in detail as we go through the course. So, whatever be the type of periodization, it is important to apply the principles, general principle of training. Important aspect is principle of variability, because following the same type of exercising regimen may lead on to something called as monotony and burnout. So, it is important to have this aspect of variability. So, that helps in kind of what you call varying the reps and sets or the programming variables, so that it kind of maintains the balance between the volume and the intensity. So, that is the principle of variability which is important to be applied in the periodization of the training program. You also need to pay attention to the athlete level. So, a periodization program developed or designed for a young level amateur athlete may not be applicable for an experienced athlete. So, you need to know what is the athlete level. A need analysis would give you that kind of idea. What type of sports again determine, because every sport has its unique demands, a unique set of biomotor ability that needs to be trained. So, that determines what type of periodization you want to actually design. And as I said, the motor quality again also determines the type of periodization and the phase of training per se. So, since you have already planned the training into different phases, that planning itself will determine what kind of type of periodization that you would like to incorporate in that particular phase of training. So, this is what we discussed about the periodization with the aspect of time. Now, moving on to the periodization application with the aspect of biomotor quality. So, you have the biomotor qualities, the major qualities for any type of sports would be strength, power, speed, endurance and flexibility. So, how do you periodize that in a plan? See, we have initially seen that annual plan is further divided into preparatory, competitive and transition. Then you have the sub phases, namely the general preparatory phase, specific preparatory phase, pre-competitive, competitive and transition, right. So, with respect to the strength, if you see, the general preparatory phase gives you an idea that you will need to focus mainly on developing anatomical adaptation. Once that overall basic foundation is laid, then you may proceed with training program to design for developing maximum strength. That will be in the specific preparatory phase. Once you have achieved that goal, you may plan during the pre-competitive phase on the advanced level, converting this maximum strength that you have trained in the previous specific preparatory phase to a more of a sport specific skills learning in terms of power and the muscle endurance that is required for that particular sports. That should be emphasized during the pre-competitive phase. Once that has been achieved, the athlete is already ready to kind of perform. So, you need to now maintain or sustain that whatever adaptation that you have arrived or reached. So, that needs to be maintained during the competitive phase in the form of maximum strength or power, whichever the requirement for that particular sports. Once that is over, when the competition is over, when the individual moves on to the transition phase, you need to also kind of compensate, in the sense the chances of disuse atrophy is there or detraining effects are there. So, you may have to kind of address to that particular requirement during the transition phase. How about endurance? When you say endurance in the general preparatory phase, you mainly focus on the aerobic endurance. When you come on to the specific preparatory phase, you focus on specific endurance that is required for that particular sports. Once you have reached that goal, during the competitive and the pre-competitive phase, the endeavor is to work on the more of a sport specific endurance, and thereafter you just maintain during the transition period with minimal amount of volume that is required to counter the detraining effects. How about speed? By virtue of speed, in terms of preparatory phase, in the general preparatory you focus on both aerobic and the aerobic endurance, both are required for speed. Subsequently, in the specific preparatory phase, you go on to specific targeted training methods to improve the high intensity interval training or anaerobic power, to improve the anaerobic power, or you can also use a lactate threshold tolerance training. So, these type of training will help to improve the speed during the specific preparatory phase. When you go on to the pre-competitive and the competitive phase, the speed component is used as a combination in terms of agility, reaction time and speed endurance, which would be required for the specific sport that the athlete is playing. So, that is how you use the periodization of time to manage time over the entire year, also to align with the biomotor quality that is required to develop during the particular period of time for that particular sports. So, when we say biomotor qualities, so there are 3 different training approach that can be used to achieve this particular planning of biomotor qualities. The first one is your parallel or concurrent approach. This is the best suited approach for novice and young athletes to develop multiple abilities at the same time. So, that is why it is concurrent approach or parallel approach. But then the limitation is that it cannot be used in terms of advanced athletes, because you are trying to kind of train multiple biomotor qualities concurrently. So, that is also kind of resulting in increasing the volume. So, for advanced athletes, when there is an overall increase in the training load or the training volume, that is the external load, that may end up in kind of overtraining. So, it is important to manage this load also for avoiding the overtraining syndrome. So, that is the limitation in parallel approach. So, hence it can be used initially when the individual is very naive, that is the time when you can use. Moving on to the next model is the sequential or block approach, which we discussed, where you have sequentially arranged the phases in way that it results in phase potentiation, and that gain which is accrued during one particular block can be transmitted to the next block. So, that is a logical way of progression of that biomotor quality, like how we discussed about the strength aspect. First you work on the broadly on the endurance aspect, then thereafter you go on to the specific power and the sport specific aspect. So, you train the athlete for achieving a basic level, then go on to the intermediate and the advanced level for that particular biomotor quality in terms of blocks. So, the effect of one block can be kind of converted or transmitted to the next block. So, that is the idea about sequential block approach. And the third approach, which commonly is used by advanced elite athletes, is the emphasis or the pendulum approach, where you kind of use this method with a vertical integration as well as horizontal sequencing, and it works basically to well for maximizing the power or the explosive strength at the level of elite level. So, for an example, let us say this is a periodization framework. So, it starts from November till next October. So, that is 1 year training plan that I have shown you here. So, divided that phases of training into it is a monocycle. So, there is only one competition. So, the competition is mainly probably in the month of April to August. So, that is the competitive phase. So, you have a monocycle where initial kind of say November to April is all about preparatory phase, you are preparing for the competition. Thereafter, you have the April to August, the competitive season, and thereafter the transition phase. So, the sub phases here are general preparatory phase and specific preparatory phase under preparatory, and this is further divided into mesocycle in terms of biomotor quality to work on the strength of the athlete. So, strength is the major biomotor quality that is required for this particular sport. So, you first initially work for first 1.5 months or 6 weeks on anatomical adaptation improvement. Once that goal is achieved by virtue of the further programming, you move on to something called as the achieving the maximum strength. So, you work on training methods to improve the maximum strength over a period of next 2 to 3 months. Then when you reach the competitive phase, the conversion effect takes place, and during the competition time you emphasize on maintaining that maximum strength and power that is accrued during the last 6 months of training. In the transition phase you go for regeneration. So, to summarize the periodization concept, periodization is all about managing time and managing the biomotor quality. It includes optimum performance with adequate recovery. So, these are the two important aspects. The terminologies in periodization, it includes planning as a blocks as in mesocycles, programming as in microcycles, dealing with multiple variables. We discussed about the hierarchical cycles in terms of the macrocycle, mesocycle, microcycle. We discussed the annual plan along with the different phases in which it is divided, types of periodization and how relevant it is for different type of athlete and what are the factors that needs to consider. We also discussed about the periodization of biomotor qualities and how it can be approached in terms of the sub phases as well. So, for those of you who are interested in further in-depth reading, I would direct you to these references. These are very good standard books. They can give you good concept on periodization principles. Thank you and Jai Hind.